So, this concludes my lyrical analyses of The Devil Went Down to Georgia and Puff the Magic Dragon. Thank you for watching, and keep in mind, ultimately, this is a rough draft. Perfect. Okay. Oh. Dear Jonah, thank you for submitting your short story to our press. After careful consideration, we've decided this submission isn't right for publication here. Kind regards, the editors. You know, when I'm feeling a little down, one of the things I like to do is pull the complete Calvin and Hobbes off my shelf. It's hard to believe the Calvin and Hobbes series only ran 10 years, a comparatively short comic lifespan compared to the likes of other iconic powerhouses like Peanuts and Garfield. But despite only 10 years of original publications, Bill Watterson certainly made a name for himself and his characters. If you're like me, you probably grew up reading a lot of Calvin and Hobbes in your school library. These comics were hot commodities from what I remember. But honestly, it's hard for me to understand what I liked so much about the series as a kid, because a lot of these individual strips seem to read more specifically to an adult audience than to children. For example, Watterson injected a surprising amount of politics into his work, more than I ever realized as a child. Like, there's this running bit where Calvin approaches his dad with a clipboard, letting him know how he's doing in the dad polls. There are a lot of entries in this genre, but here are two of my favorites. "Well, Dad, your polls are real high this week." "I'm glad to hear that." "Yep, those polled think you're doing a fine job as dad. In fact, with a little push today, your political stock could reach a record high." "Nice try. Go help your mom with the dishes." "Ooh, Dad, suicide. Ooh. 1988 isn't too far away, Dad. If you're thinking of running for dad again, you'd better get your campaign in gear. Frankly, the polls look grim. I don't think you've got much of a shot at keeping the office." I take comfort in the fact that not many people would want it. Flippant remarks have a way of haunting candidates, you know. Strips with political lingo such as these aren't all that surprising when you learn that Bill Watterson was a political science major. See, he decided to study politics because he thought for sure he'd be a political cartoonist. And even though Calvin and Hobbes isn't explicitly a political cartoon, the inclusion of politics goes way beyond just lingo. There are strips where Watterson is clearly injecting political messaging. For example, his anti-war strips. "How come we play war and not peace? Too few role models. I'll be the fearless American defender of liberty and democracy, and you can be the loathsome, godless communist oppressor. We're at war, so if you get hit with a dart, you're dead and the other side wins, okay? Gotcha. Go!" Kind of a stupid game, isn't it? For those just listening to the video, Calvin and Hobbes hit each other with darts at the same time. Even though Watterson's comics weren't always entirely accessible to children, I think the message here is pretty clear to readers of any age. War is brutal, and for all the wars that may have a quote-unquote winner, nobody really wins in a war, certainly not those who fight it on the leader's behalf. It reminds me of Dan Olson's words when discussing Pink Floyd's The Wall.
"Soldiers sent to war don't die for their country, they just die."
Watterson famously published these strips toward the end of the Cold War, as the threat of nuclear war loomed over the world at every moment. As such, Watterson's stance on war and world leadership was pretty clear. Here's another strip that always gets a good chuckle out of me, especially for its poignancy. "Hey Calvin, what you doing?" "Shh, quiet down or you'll give away my position. Hobbes and I are having a water fight." "A water fight? Can I play?" "You? Ha! War is a manly art." "I suppose anything so idiotic would have to be. Can I play in your game or not?" "I don't know, it seems like you'd rather be making smart remarks." For as funny as it is, there's some weight to Susie's words there. As the book Why Leaders Fight tells us, from 1875 to 2004, men were responsible for 694 acts of aggression and 86 wars, while women were responsible for just 13 acts of aggression and only 1 war. Granted, the authors conclude that women who lead nations still have the same risk propensity as their male counterparts, like Margaret Thatcher, for example. And while we're on the subject of Thatcher, let's take a look at this comic. "Somewhere in communist Russia, I'll bet there's a little boy who has never known anything but censorship and oppression. But maybe he's heard of America, and he dreams of living in this land of freedom and opportunity. Someday I'd like to meet that little boy. And tell him the awful truth about this place. Calvin, be quiet and eat the stupid lima beans." Now, it's clear what the joke is here, and yet I can't help but feeling there's a bit of truth to Calvin's words. To turn to Dan Olson again, under Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US, there were clear growing fascist movements in the nations that bragged about beating the Nazis. Of course, charitably, you could say that Reagan and Thatcher didn't cause those movements, and sure, but citizens of the West still had to face
the policies of austerity, of rigid enforcement of Christian norms, the violent suppression of political dissent, of a rising homegrown fascist movement, criticisms that predate the AIDS crisis but would hold true well into the 80s as governments decided it was unofficial policy that AIDS was a divine punishment and a solution to their gay crisis.
Granted, perhaps you think I'm reading too much into these strips. For all the commentary we might see herein, for all the poignancy audiences might have felt then and we can still feel now in modern America, Calvin and Hobbes is meant to make us smile more than anything, right? Well, certainly, but I do think there are political issues where Watterson took an even more obvious stance, like environmentalism. For instance, take a look at this strip. Hey mom, what's this I hear about the greenhouse effect? They say the pollutants we dump in the air are trapping in the sun's heat and it's going to melt the polar ice caps? Sure, you'll be gone when it happens, but I won't. Nice planet you're leaving me. This from the kid who wants to be chauffeured any place more than a block away. Hey, nobody told me about the ice caps, alright? This strip actually comes toward the end of Calvin and Hobbes' first 2-year run. Even before this, Watterson was making his pro-environmental, anti-industrial stance clear. Let's keep going backwards from the greenhouse strip. Just a few days prior, Watterson had this one published. Can you believe this? Some idiot tossed garbage here in this beautiful spot. I'll bet future civilizations find out more about us than we'd like them to know. Look, another can thrown on the ground. Boy, this makes me mad. By golly, if people aren't burying toxic wastes or testing nuclear weapons, they're throwing trash everywhere. You'd think planets like this were a dime a dozen. Now I've got to carry this gross thing. You know, there are times when it's a source of personal pride to not be human. I'm with you. There are multiple lines that resonate here, like the toxic waste and nuclear weapons, but most especially when Calvin says, "You'd think planets like this were a dime a dozen." It's sort of a cliche to say we've only got one Earth, but that really is just how it is. We really do only have one Earth. Calvin's criticism of militants and industrialists is especially clear in these panels. Here's a little town. Here's a steam shovel scooping out a giant hole. Here comes the bulldozer, pushing thousands of barrels of toxic nuclear waste into the giant hole. Over the years, these dangerous poisons seep into underground waterways. The cancer rate of the nearby little town triples. If you want me, I'll be under the bed. Hobbes' reaction here is utterly relatable as Calvin's playtime became a little too real. For example, nuclear tests that took place in Nevada still affect residents of the state and southern Utah to this day. What these comics also show is something that's especially clear throughout the totality of the series: Bill Watterson's deep love and respect for animals. Going back further yet again, we have these panels from March 1987. Hey, what happened to the trees here? Who cleared out the woods? There used to be lots of animals in these woods. Now it's a mud pit. The sign says, future site of Shady Acres condominiums. Animals can't afford condos. Shady Acres? The only shade I see is from that bulldozer. Where are all the animals supposed to live now that they cut down these woods to put in houses? By golly, how would people like it if animals bulldozed a suburb and put in new trees? No good. They didn't leave the keys. It took hundreds of years for these woods to grow, and they leveled it in a week. It's gone. After they build new houses here, they'll have to widen the roads and put up gas stations, and pretty soon this whole area will be just a big strip. Eventually, there won't be a nice spot left anywhere. I wonder if you can refuse to inherit the world. I think if you're born, it's too late. Much like the first anti-war comic I showed here, these strips might make one smile from their humorous elements, and yet they also step back and say something much more profound. Calvin and Hobbes' exchange at the end there particularly resonates. I wonder if you can refuse to inherit the world. I don't think I need to express how many millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha feel that way. And Hobbes' statement says a lot without saying very much at all, as all good poetry does. If you're born, it's too late. But that doesn't have to be a bad thing. You might not have asked to be born, you might not have asked to inherit this earth, but now that you're here, don't you have a duty to make this world the best it can be for everyone? I think I've brought it up before, but it reminds me of this quote from Mrs. Dalloway. As we are a doomed race chained to a sinking ship, as the whole thing is a bad joke, let us, at any rate, do our part, mitigate the sufferings of our fellow prisoners, decorate the dungeon with flowers and air cushions, be as decent as we possibly can. Sorry, just a second. Dear Jonah, thank you for submitting your poems. We regret that we are unable to publish them, but we appreciate your interest. Where was I? Oh yeah, Calvin and Hobbes. You know, as another fun fact, Bill Watterson considered himself sort of an ignorant person. When he chose to major in political science, he did it because it was his weakest subject. As he writes at the beginning of the complete Calvin and Hobbes, despite having grown up in the Vietnam Watergate era, I somehow never paid much attention to government, history, politics, or for that matter, the news in my 18 years of life. I see now that this was rather a liability in choosing political cartooning as a career path, but ignorance breeds courage. Watterson also includes this cartoon he wrote for his college yearbook, wherein the student says, 2 pages, great. How am I ever going to stretch an explanation of the Vietnam War to 5 pages? It definitely makes a reader wonder if Calvin's experiences in the classroom were based off of Watterson's. After all, Watterson admits that Calvin and Hobbes are just 2 halves of himself. And speaking of Calvin's performance in the classroom, there is quite a lot we could say about that when reading through the eyes of an adult. It's almost funny how poorly Calvin does in school when looking at his vocabulary. Like, take this strip. Here we find a thriving city, brand new buildings, a bustling economy. A scenic thoroughfare winds through this happy municipality. Here, a farmer drives his livestock to market. Tragically, this serene metropolis lies directly beneath the Hoover Dam. No one Calvin's age actually talks like this. Of course, we're completely willing to suspend our disbelief in that regard, but still. How can Calvin clearly know so much, but still struggle so much in school? There's actually a later Calvin and Hobbes comic that addresses this, but we're just sticking to the first 2 years for now, so if you know it, you don't have to sound off in the comments. One thing we could note is that Calvin primarily seems to struggle with math while doing better in the humanities, but even that isn't always the case, so maybe there's more to it. As a kid, when I saw Calvin struggling in school, I figured that was just par for the course. As an adult, though, I kind of have to wonder if Calvin has an untreated learning disability or some other condition. There's this strip I really love where Calvin is attempting to read, but he ends up getting tossed around by his furniture and thrown downstairs. His mom asks, "What on earth are you doing? Where's your homework?" And Calvin says, "I couldn't concentrate." Now, I love this strip because, on the one hand, it kind of reminds me of Snoopy fighting the lawn chair in Charlie Brown Thanksgiving, which is neat because Watterson says that Schultz was a huge influence on him. But I also love this strip because it feels like a great metaphor for ADHD. But Calvin's inability to focus seems to go beyond just ADHD. Even in the most crucial moments, we see Calvin's mind wandering, like in this instance where he's talking to his principal. Could there be a worse time for Calvin to lose focus? He just can't help himself. As he's done many times before, he imagines himself as Spaceman Spiff and the authority figure as an alien. In looking at panels such as these, I started to wonder if maybe Calvin has maladaptive daydreaming. There's also some autistic coding in Calvin's characterization. And keep in mind, I've never been diagnosed with ADHD, any other learning disability, maladaptive daydreaming, or autism, so if you think it's not my place to make these points, I hear you. And even if we can read the strips in such a way, that's probably not what Bill Watterson intended. He probably wanted to just portray a kid with a lot of imagination. Still, it's so valuable that children and adults with developmental or learning disabilities can see themselves in Calvin, identify with him, and relate to him. For those of you with diagnoses, I would love to hear from you. But even when looking at Calvin as just a highly imaginative kid, a lot of folks have painted him as schizophrenic. Take the young adult book Calvin, where a 17-year-old Calvin is literally diagnosed with schizophrenia, and it's asserted that Hobbes was just a voice in his head all along. Sometimes that really does seem like the only clear explanation. Like, how is it that Hobbes can do and know certain things that Calvin can't? Unless Hobbes really is a magic tiger that only Calvin can interact with for some reason. Like, there's this strip from December 1986 where Calvin and Hobbes are playing Scrabble. Calvin comes up with words like be and in. Meanwhile, Hobbes gets words like zygomorphic and nucleoplasm. But it's not Hobbes getting those words, it's Calvin, seeing as Hobbes is imaginary. Unless... But no, in reality, the only true explanation here is that Calvin is just very imaginative. It was likely that imagination that kept pulling me back to Calvin and Hobbes. It inspired me in a lot of ways. I still look back very fondly on the Transmogrifier arc of the series. This, plus that imagination episode of SpongeBob, really opened up the possibilities in my young mind of what a cardboard box could really be. Then there's this strip, which I'll read here. The experiment has gone horribly wrong. Calvin has mutated into a giant fly. He zips about in parasitic hunger, searching for decaying flesh. An unbearable stench fills the air. The hideous bug zeroes in. This makes me hungry. Don't be gross, just take out the garbage like I asked you, will you please? I remember as a kid, I always tried to come up with games to make certain tasks more manageable, and I wouldn't be surprised if I learned that behavior from Calvin. I honestly wish I could have kept that mindset into adulthood, or rather, I wish I would think to do things like this with the everyday tasks that seem so stupidly insurmountable to me. I also want to highlight a couple of poems that Watterson wrote. This first one is called The Yukon Song, and it's based on the arc of the series where Calvin and Hobbes try to leave home and walk up to the Yukon. This poem was never in the papers, but instead written for the third published collection titled Yukon Ho. The poem reads, "My tiger friend has got the sled, and I have packed a snack. We're all set for the trip ahead, we're never coming back. We're abandoning this life we've led, so long, Mom and Pup. We're sick of doing what you've said, and now it's going to stop. We're going where it snows all year, where life can have real meaning, a place where we won't have to hear, your room could stand some cleaning. The Yukon is the place for us. That's where we want to live. Up there we'll get to yell and cuss and act real primitive. We'll never have to go to school forced into submission by monstrous crabby teachers who will make us learn addition. We'll never have to clean a plate of veggie glops and goos. Messily we'll masticate using any fork we choose. The timber wolves will be our friends. We'll stay up late and howl at the moon till nighttime ends before going on the prowl. Oh, what a life, we cannot wait to be in that Arctic land, where we'll be masters of our fate, and lead a life that's grand. No more of parental rules, we're heading for some snow. Good riddance to those grown-up ghouls. We're leaving. Yukon Ho." This is far from the only instance that Watterson would write poetry for the series, which I just think is so wonderful. I think this poem and the next one I'm about to read really demonstrate how fun poetry can be. It doesn't always have to be serious or deep or poignant. Sometimes there's just value in poetry that's fun and silly. Watterson says that his goal when doing comics was always to make his wife laugh, and I have to imagine that was the case with these poems too. Here's the other one, titled A Nauseous Nocturne. Much like the Yukon Song, this poem was never published in papers, but was included in The Essential Calvin and Hobbes, the first printed collection. Another night deprived of slumber, hours passing without number. My eyes trace round the room. I lay, dripping sweat, and now quite certain that tonight the final curtain drops upon my short life's precious play. From the darkness, by the closet, comes a noise much like a faucet, makes a maddening drip, drip, dripping sound. It seems some ill-proportioned beast, anticipating me deceased, is drooling poison puddles on the ground. A can of mace, a 45, is all I need to stay alive, but no weapon lies within my sight. Oh my gosh, a shadow's creeping, ominous and black it's seeping, slowly cross a moonlit square of light. Suddenly a floorboard creak announces the blood-sucking freak is here to steal my future years away. A sulphurous smell now fills the room, heralding my imminent doom. A fang gleams in the dark and murky gray. Oh, blood-red eyes and tentacles, throbbing, pulsing ventricles, mucus oozing pores and frightful claws. Worse, in terms of outright scariness, are the suckers multifarious that grab and force you in its mighty jaws. This disgusting aberration of nature needs no motivation to devour helpless children in their beds. Relishing despairing moans, it chews kids up and sucks their bones, and dissolves inside its mouth their little heads. I know this 'cause I read it not 2 hours ago, and then I got the heebie-jeebies and these awful shakes. My parents swore upon their honor that I was safe and not a goner. I guess tomorrow they'll see their sad mistakes. In the morning they'll come in and say, "What was that awful din we heard last night? You kept us both from sleep." Only then will they surmise the gruesomeness of my demise, and see that my remains are in a heap. Dad will look at Mom and say, "Too bad he had to go that way." And Mom will look at Dad and nod assent. Mom will add, "Still, it's fitting that as he was this world quitting, he should leave another mess before he went." They may not mind at first, I know. They will miss me later, though, and perhaps admit that they were wrong. As memories of me grow dim, they'll say, "We were too strict with him. We should have listened to him all along." As speedily my end approaches, I bid a final buenas noches to my best friend here in all the world. Gently snoring, whiskers seeming to sniff at smells. He must be dreaming. He lies snuggled in the blankets, curled. "Hey, wake up, you stupid cretin! You gonna sleep while I get eaten?" Suddenly the monster knows I'm not alone. There's an animal in bed with me, an awful beast he did not see. The monster never would have come if he had known. The monster in his consternation demonstrates defenestration and runs and runs and runs and runs away. Rid of the pest, I can now rest, thanks to my best friend who saved the day. If you're a poetry nerd such as myself, you probably clocked that this poem is loosely fashioned after Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, which is just awesome. I honestly think this piece really demonstrates Watterson's talent as a cartoonist, both in the writing and the artwork. Much like Calvin himself, the creativity is on full display. Also, rhyming consternation with defenestration. Man, I just love that. I have to wonder if Watterson ever imagined he would one day be creating something like this, especially with how many bumps in the road there were to his eventual success. For example, some years before creating his flagship characters, Watterson actually had a job as an editorial cartoonist at the Cincinnati Post. Now, on paper, that sounds like a killer job, but, well, see how he tells it. The job was a disaster from the very first day when, after several rough ideas were rejected, I submitted increasingly bizarre sketches in the frantic hope of making the deadline, until the editor finally came out of his office, walked over to my desk, and told me to call it a day. It went downhill from there. I was completely out of my depth, rarely got published, and within a few months, the fraud that was my career was over. Of course, if you think about it, that was a necessary failure. Without getting fired from the Cincinnati Post, Watterson never would have gone back to the kind of cartooning he loved, and there likely wouldn't be a Calvin and Hobbes. Watterson himself acknowledges this. In hindsight, all this failure was my good fortune. I'm honestly grateful that all my early strip submissions were flatly rejected. That was not a case of syndicate editors failing to recognize latent genius. My strips had serious flaws, so I'm very lucky I didn't get stuck trying to make one of them fly. I recently got the chance to hear from author Shruti Swami, who said something very similar. I'm paraphrasing her, but she essentially said, "Be grateful for the time it takes you to get published. You get more time to write, to get better. That time is a gift. Forces conspire to give you the time to work on what you believe in." Oh, sorry. Give me just 1 second. Dear Jonah, thank you for submitting your flash fiction to us. We were glad to have the chance to read your work, but unfortunately, we were not able to find a place for it. You know what else Watterson liked to write about? Media. News and media. There are many strips that openly criticize just how much inappropriate content is available to young audiences, even on the news. Take this early strip. It says here that by the age of 6, most children have seen 1 million murders on television. I find that very disturbing. It means I've been watching all the wrong channels. Now, notably, Watterson is exaggerating here, but the point still stands pretty well, even when looking at the accurate statistics. The American Psychiatric Association wrote in 1998 that by the time they reach age 18, children have seen 16,000 murders and 200,000 acts of violence in media. One can only imagine how services like YouTube have affected those numbers. But it's not just violence, there's also plenty of sexual content available to underage audiences. This here is one of Watterson's earliest Calvin and Hobbes strips. "Oh, Mary, you look ravishing in that skimpy negligee. Darling, don't you wish we were married? But we are. Or did you mean to each other? I've got to have you. Let's murder our spouses." Murder? You sick animal. I love it when you talk that way. Come here. Sometimes I think I learn more when I stay home from school. There's also this strip, which has got to be one of my favorites. "Dad, how come you live in this house with Mom, instead of in an apartment with several scantily clad female roommates?" Boy, ask a simple question and get all your television privileges revoked. Now, you can say my reading is too charitable here, but I don't think Watterson means to criticize all TV in general. Rather, I think he's criticizing those at the top who make content like this so accessible to children. Accessibility is clearly a big issue for him. This strip exemplifies that well. "Wow, 3 more magazines for me today. Yesterday I got 5. I love getting all this mail. How come you receive all these magazines?" I went to the library and filled out all the subscription cards that said, "Bill me later." This feels like a critique against those who would prey on naivety and children's sensibilities, not to mention services that would prey on those with fluctuating or low income. It feels like the options we have nowadays to finance anything we buy in multiple payments. Order it now, pay for it later. Also, as an aside, it's crazy that Calvin can read and understand all these magazines, or so it seems at least. It just harkens back to how smart he actually is. Watterson also pretty clearly has a problem with advertisements and advertisers. He very famously never wanted to commercialize Calvin and Hobbes as characters, but that's a deeper discussion for another day. As far as his critique of ads, there's this strip. In the commercials, this cola greatly increases one's sex appeal. Gloop, 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 gloop. Brr. Evidently a little license on Madison Avenue's part. Phew, right up my nose. I don't think this one needs much explaining. We know ads exaggerate, but kids don't know that. In fact, kids often don't know that they're being advertised to at all. That's why children's content must disclose when something is paid promotion, even though many kids likely won't know what that means either. Speaking of exaggeration, I also have to highlight this comic. Tomorrow we're going to discuss current events in school. Each of us has to find a newspaper article, read it to the class, and explain it. What article did you choose? This one. Space alien weds two-headed Elvis clone. Actually, there's not much left to explain. Okay, it's likely that Calvin is reading a crazy tabloid, but even so, Watterson is clearly critical of what might pass for news, what a child might mistake for news, for that matter. News organizations are for-profit businesses. We know this. They are not above clickbaiting us. Now, earlier I said that Watterson perhaps wasn't critical of TV in general, but there are strips that might suggest otherwise. These strips show that Watterson, even in the 1980s, was worried about screen addiction. In this strip, Calvin says, "I just read this great science fiction story. It's about how machines take control of humans and turn them into zombie slaves. So instead of controlling machines, they control us? Pretty scary idea. I'll say, hey, what time is it? My TV show is on." It's pretty significant that the strip starts with Calvin having read something, only to end with him wanting to rush to the TV. I don't think it takes a genius to see what's communicated by that progression. Again, services like YouTube and the advent of laptops, tablets, and cell phones have surely only exacerbated this problem, and I have to wonder what Watterson thinks about it all now. I also wanted to highlight these panels. It says here that religion is the opiate of the masses. What do you suppose that means? It means Karl Marx hadn't seen anything yet. What are you watching? Garbage. This show would insult a 6-year-old, and I should know. So why watch it? All the other shows are even worse. Well, why watch TV at all, then? There's nothing to do. Nothing to do? You could read a book, or write a letter, or take a walk. When you're old, you'll wish you had more than memories of this tripe to look back on. Undoubtedly. Again, for those just listening, the strip ends with Hobbes joining Calvin in front of the TV. This sort of feels like a tacit admission on Watterson's part that, for all the criticism he levels at TV, he can't help but indulge in it either. And frankly, I don't think there's anything wrong with decompressing with some escapism from time to time, or indulging in high art that TV and movie makers can produce. But Hobbes has a point. We don't want to look back and find that our memories involved so much of our screens. Speaking of getting older, looking back, and making memories, this feels like a good time to talk about Watterson's motivations. Why did he choose to be a cartoonist, despite the uphill climb to publication and the work it required? To quote him, "The older I get, the more weighted and complex everything seems, so I'm learning new skills, hoping to expand my range of expression. 10 years after Calvin and Hobbes, I still don't know where this is going, but I have a basic faith that eventually some good will come out of the process. Drawing has always been the way I get at whatever I'm thinking about. In Calvin and Hobbes, I used my childhood, sometimes straight out of the can, sometimes wildly fictionalized, and sometimes as a metaphor for my 20s and 30s, to talk about my life and the issues that interested me. Without exactly intending to, I learned a lot about what I love: imagination, deep friendship, animals, family, the natural world, ideas, ideals, and silliness. These things make my life meaningful, and having the opportunity to consider it all at length through the medium of drawing was the most personally rewarding part of Calvin and Hobbes. Giving words and form to what had previously been jumbled, half-conscious thoughts, I occasionally felt like I hit some truth, and in doing so, got to know myself a bit better." Nope, not even gonna check it this time. With Watterson's reflections there in mind, there's one more thing I want to talk about. The philosophical and religious strips from the series. And I mean, come on, you had to have known this was coming. The characters' names are Calvin and Hobbes, after all. A lot of these strips open with the philosophical concept, but basically just use it as setup for the punchline and don't go much deeper than that. For example, do you think it's better to live in stupefying security or to take risks and live life on the edge? I think it's better to accept danger and live to the fullest. I take it by your silence that you agree. Even though this one is kind of just a joke, it also very effectively and economically shows one of the fundamental differences between Calvin and Hobbes, the former's recklessness and the latter's more reasonable nature. Hobbes doesn't say a word in this strip, and yet you come to know so much about him. It's awesome. Then there's this one, which I would argue is among the most famous strips from the series. Do you think there's a God? Well, somebody's out to get me. I find it so interesting how this one opens with a panel free of dialogue showing Calvin and Hobbes just looking up at the sky. That was probably part of what prompted the question, and I like how the answer is funny, unsatisfactory, and how the whole exchange again epitomizes these characters so well. But let's talk about some of the recurring philosophical ideas. First, free will. Do you believe our destinies are controlled by the stars? No, I think we can do whatever we want with our lives. Not to hear mom and dad tell it. Again, this one feels sort of jokey, but I do really love Hobbes' smile of contentment after he makes his stance on free will clear. In many ways, this comic feels sort of like a follow-up to one of Watterson's earliest. Do you believe in fate? You mean that our lives are predestined? Yeah, that the things we do are inevitable. What a scary thought. This one is also funny, but in a George Carlin sort of way where you laugh, but you also go, huh. I can't help but feel Hobbes is right. The ideas of predestination and determinism are pretty scary. I can't help thinking it sort of takes away from what makes us human. But it's also funny to point out that Calvin here is the one asking about predestination, since that's Calvinism's whole thing. Another big idea is, perhaps surprisingly, death. There are 3 separate strips where Calvin wonders out loud about what happens after death. Take a look. I wonder where we go when we die. Pittsburgh? You mean if we're good or if we're bad? I want to again point out the significance that Calvin and Hobbes are looking up at the sky in the 2nd and 4th panel. But anyhow, here's the next strip. Hobbes, what do you think happens to us when we die? I think we play saxophone for an all-girl cabaret in New Orleans. So you believe in heaven? Call it what you like. This one reminds me of Rango, where the titular character meets the spirit of the West and asks, "Is this heaven?" The spirit responds, "If it were, we'd be eating Pop-Tarts with Kim Novak." Lastly, there's this strip. I have a question. Do you believe in life after death? You know, reincarnation. You just steer, okay? So primarily, I think these strips are jokes, and yet I think it says something, both about the characters and about Watterson, that Calvin thinks so much about death. Honestly, I think that's true to life. Even at 6 years old, we can't help but think about life and its end. This truth is highlighted by one of the series' most significant arcs, the raccoon arc. These 9 strips start with Calvin and Hobbes finding a wounded raccoon in the woods. Calvin goes and gets his mom, who tells him to get a shoebox and a clean dish towel. He complies, and they wrap up the raccoon and put it in the box. What's interesting is that we never see the raccoon for ourselves. They take the animal in, but it refuses to eat anything. The 5th strip in the arc features the following exchange. I can't sleep. Me either. I keep thinking about the raccoon. I hope he lives. Me too. I think animals are always so cute. This is another one of those strips that, while maybe eliciting a chuckle, prompts more of a from the reader. Like, yes, it's both funny and obvious that Hobbes would be endeared toward other animals, but at the same time, you feel the injustice. Animals really are so cute, and how unfair is it that some of them have to die so cruelly? In the next strip, Calvin's dad tells him the raccoon did indeed die. What always impresses me is how Calvin's dad didn't sugarcoat it. It would have been easy to lie to Calvin, to say the raccoon recovered and left, or that they took it to the vet, but the fact Calvin gets the truth really says something about the relationship he has with his parents, despite all of their ups and downs. Very significantly, this strip ends with Calvin saying, "I'm crying because out there he's gone, but he's not gone inside me." What a succinct way to illustrate the grief a death can cause. Now let's walk through the last 3 strips in this arc. This is where Dad buried the little raccoon. I didn't even know he existed a few days ago, and now he's gone forever. It's like I found him for no reason. I had to say goodbye as soon as I said hello. Still, in a sad, awful, terrible way, I'm happy I met him. What a stupid world. We can certainly laugh at the way Calvin expresses his frustration in that last panel, especially compared to the way he put it in previous panels. Nevertheless, his word choice doesn't take away from the fact that he's right. Sometimes the world feels very, very stupid, especially after tragic, unexplainable loss. The next strip reads, "You know, Hobbes, I can't figure out this death stuff. Why did that little raccoon have to die? He didn't do anything wrong. He was just little. What's the point of putting him here and taking him back so soon? It's either mean or it's arbitrary, and either way, I've got the heebie-jeebies. Why is it always night when we talk about these things?" There's honestly a lot to say here. First of all, that Calvin sees death as a punishment. Calvin emphasizes that the raccoon didn't do anything wrong, implying that a fate such as death should really only come to those who deserve it. But the fact is, unfortunately, we all die, the good and the bad. Still, he certainly has a point. Animals are so utterly blameless. What do they do to deserve cruel fates? This is a natural line of questioning, and ultimately Calvin arrives at the conclusion that death is either mean or it's arbitrary. Mean because how could a creature like that raccoon die, and arbitrary because the raccoon shouldn't have died, but it did anyway, as many good living things do. So, what do we do in the face of this meanness and/or arbitrariness? The last strip reads, "Mom says death is as natural as birth, and it's all part of the life cycle. She says we don't really understand it, but there are many things we don't understand, and we just have to do the best we can with the knowledge we have. I guess that makes sense. But don't you go anywhere. Don't worry." It's so extremely tender, it's enough to make a grown man cry. I think Calvin's mom's advice is sound. We just have to do the best we can. But what the last panel really emphasizes is, while we know so little about death, and while we can't do anything about it, what we can do is strengthen our ties with those who are still here. We can make others feel better with our presence, and vice versa. You know, it's funny. For some reason, I thought the raccoon arc was much later in the series' history. A few months before the raccoon arc, Watterson published this strip. "I don't understand this business about death. If we're just going to die, what's the point of living? Well, there's seafood. I don't know why I even talked to you before dinner." Again, this is a funny strip, but it actually very effectively demonstrates the difference between Calvin and Hobbes in these matters. Calvin often finds himself preoccupied with his worries, including metaphysical worries, while Hobbes seems more interested in living in the moment, which will move us into our last big idea: happiness. Take a look at this strip. What do you think is the secret to happiness? Is it money, power, or fame? I'd choose money. If you have enough money, you can buy power and fame. That way you would have it all and be really happy. Happiness is being famous for your financial ability to indulge in every kind of excess. I suppose that's one way to define it. The part I think I'd like best is crushing people who get in my way. So I love this strip. It's hilarious while also pointing out something obvious in a creative and engaging way. Hobbes, and to a greater extent Watterson, are criticizing Calvin for his naivety around happiness. And since Calvin is just a part of Watterson, really this is just self-criticism. It reads as though Watterson may have thought at some point in his life the way Calvin thinks here. The strip is sort of a self-assurance, a reminder that happiness is far simpler than money, fame, power, excess, and material indulgence. We see that truth in other strips too, like this one. "If you could wish for anything, what would it be?" "A big sunny field to be in." "A stupid field? You've got that now. Think big, riches, power, pretend you could have anything." Actually, it's hard to argue with someone who looks so happy. It's a pretty simple, even cliché moral, one that Shel Silverstein touched on a lot too, but happiness is much simpler than we want to make it sometimes. We can make our own happiness out of very little, out of the things the world has already provided for us. And I know it's more nuanced than that in many ways given the systems we live in, but how many times has taking a walk outside cheered you up? I think Watterson is really getting at something so fundamentally human here. I want to end with this strip, which feels very Winnie the Pooh to me. You know what I like about summer days? They're just made for doing things, even if it's nothing, especially if it's nothing. This strip is pretty neat, for one thing because Hobbes does more of the talking, which often doesn't feel like the case in these earlier publications. What's more, Calvin and Hobbes really agree here, which they don't always do. And like I said, the messaging feels very Winnie the Pooh to me, that sometimes there is so much joy in just doing nothing. There's always this constant pressure to be productive and make the most of our time, when sometimes making the most of our time means just letting it pass without worry or concern. Easier said than done, for sure, and certainly easier for a 6-year-old than a 25-year-old, but there's so much to learn from the way Calvin and Hobbes live. Watterson was just 27 years old when he published the first Calvin and Hobbes strip, which is genuinely so impressive. One thing I love about revisiting the early years is the subtle progression that takes place, especially in the art style. The first strips of Calvin and Hobbes make the characters look a little different, and yet it's hard to put your finger on why. Over time, the lovable cartoons were shaped into the sharper, more consistent versions we know today. It's neat seeing the early, unpublished strips of Calvin and Hobbes, where Calvin was given a mop-top bowl cut instead of his iconic spiky hair. As he writes in the complete collection, my editor later made the obvious suggestion to show the eyes of my central character. Seeing this progression makes Watterson's story all the more inspiring to me. To quote him once again, newspaper cartooning is an endurance sport, and you need characters and situations that won't run dry in a few months. My early strip proposals were unevenly written, an occasional good character surrounded by flat ones, put into limited or cliched worlds beyond my experience. These are common mistakes, but the only way to learn how to write and draw is by writing and drawing. The good thing about working with almost no audience was that I felt free to experiment. Nobody cared what I did, so I tried pretty much anything that came into my head, acquired some new skills along the way, and gradually learned a bit about what worked and what didn't. As I say, that's what I think in retrospect. At the time, it all just seemed like banging my head against a wall. To persist in the face of continual rejection requires a deep love of the work itself, and learning that lesson kept me from ever taking Calvin and Hobbes for granted when the strip took off years later. But in the midst of repeated failure, some self-delusion about your abilities also comes in handy. Okay, one more look. Dear Jonah, thank you for sending us your short story. Unfortunately, this particular piece was not a right fit for this issue. But we were impressed by your writing. We hope that you will feel encouraged by this short note and send us something else. We look forward to reading more. Sincerely, the editors. You know what? I'll take it. Hey, you made it to the end. Thank you so much for watching. As a treat, here's the cat that Bill Watterson based Hobbes on. Adorable, no? The cat's name is Sprite, and Watterson said it had an unnerving tendency to come out of nowhere at high speed. Sounds familiar, I'm sure. I hope you were as inspired by these strips and Watterson's story as I was. This video was originally supposed to be a full series retrospective, but I found so much in just the first 2 years of the strip that I had to focus only on the first collection. If you'd like to see more of this, please let me know, and if you liked this video, please do all the things the algorithm likes. You can also consider supporting me on Patreon. You're seeing the names of my patrons scrolling on screen right now. I genuinely can't thank them enough for their support. Feel free to follow me on my socials, and for some unscripted writing tips, go subscribe to the second channel where I take a look at your work. Thanks again for watching, and keep in mind, ultimately, this is a rough draft. So, yesterday I had someone tell me I look like Farrah Fawcett, which, huge compliment. And before I started parting my hair in the middle like this, I had someone tell me I look like sorry, not John Cena, Michael Cera. Uh, so also huge compliment. That being said, still don't know what I'm doing with my hair really. So if anyone has any suggestions, or if you have any other celebrity lookalikes, let me know.